Welcome to another video. I'm your host, and with my cup of coffee in my hand, I'm going to start off with sharing some secrets from the kitchen, namely what a supervisor would think while reading your research paper. And these are some of the most common feedback that I've given people based on the work they've produced. And this feedback is for undergraduate, masters, but also PhD dissertations, theses. So let's get to it. The very first thing you may have heard and people keep saying is you should narrow down. What does that actually mean? Being asked to narrow down your topic means that you're being too ambitious. You're looking at a phenomena that's too big and you should put it into pieces, pick one piece, slash it into two, and then take that small chunk, whatever is left. And this is exactly what you should be looking at. In academia, it's all about contribution, but even the slightest of thing can be a contribution. You don't need to be claiming to be changing the way a given organization operates, for example, but it may be enough to just look at, let's say, a specific practice and how this practice can be made more efficient, or how people make decisions within that organization. In a nutshell, you have to pick something extremely small, and you should try to become an expert in this. That's why we always say that good researchers are good consultants, because you can go in any organization or any context and you can solve this problem because you know the steps to how this problem can be resolved, or you know why this problem occurred in the first place. The second thing that I always keep saying to my students is, so what? Very often somebody is claiming that they have observed this in the field, they found this data, and then I keep asking, okay, so what? What are you going to do with that data? What does this data actually show you? Does this data changes the things that we believed in previously? Is this something different from what other scholars have been finding? So you should be able to address this question, so what? You will get it at some point. Even if it's not in a written feedback, you may get it when you're conducting a presentation, when you're presenting your findings, etc. You should know what does that actually mean for the study if you manage to find that this person conducts this specific activity. Another thing that I always give in terms of feedback relates to the structure of the dissertation. Everybody knows the structure. There's an abstract, there is introduction, methodology, findings, discussion, conclusion, and then references and appendix. Everybody knows it. However, how people approach the structure within each chapter is very different. I always want my students to start off with discussing the broader practical problem in the introduction chapter, but in the first third of the introduction chapter. And then I want them to claim how this can be resolved and what kind of theoretical frameworks they are trying to utilize for the resolution of this problem. And then in the last 1/3 of the introduction, I want them to actually discuss really briefly what the findings are and what the contribution is. And that's why the introduction chapter is the last one to write. Another feedback that I often have is for the methodology section. No matter what methodology you're using, most people who write their methodology chapters somehow forget to write the limitations of the methodology. So if you haven't seen the video on limitations that I have posted, go ahead and watch it, and it will show you what exactly the limitations of your research could be and how these should be presented. But make sure that you have limitations, and make sure you also have a discussion of alternative methods that you've considered, and provide justification about why you have decided to use other methods. What would be the logic? You have to justify it, and you should use some references to scholars who have tried to do something similar to what you're doing, and they've used those methods, because this is extra support that helps you. Believe it or not, very often I'm questioning people's choice to conduct a significant data collection, to get thousands of questionnaires, to interview, let's say, 100 people. I'm very often challenging this. I often try to convince people not to do that, because it would be super time consuming and maybe it's not necessary. Not to mention, if you collect way too much data, primary data especially, then this may take away from the rigor when it comes to analyzing this data. So naturally, this leads to how people tackle the findings section or how they present the findings and analysis of their work. Very often, no matter how much effort you put into this chapter, one aspect that I always find lacking is the visual presentation of data. So make sure that you have very clear charts. It could be flow charts, it could be tables, diagrams that present the data. So if somebody is to skip reading the findings, they can at least have a look at the visuals and they would know what the main ideas are. And this holds equally for qualitative work and quantitative work. For quantitative work, it's almost by definition that you have to have tables to present the data. But very often for qualitative work, people shy away from this. They think having quotes is enough, but this is not quite the case. You have to have a visual, you have to have a flow charts, if you wish, that shows how the process went, or at least how the process is justified from the perspective of your respondent, etc. Not to mention that it's time to illustrate all the coding or the clustering of themes that happen during the analysis process. You have to show visuals of this. Something that I see very often is people trying to put some literature and references within the findings and analysis chapter. This is a big no. You should try to stay away from doing this because this is not a literature review. Going further into the discussion chapter, most of my feedback often is on the inability of the student to add something new in this chapter. Typically, most people just repeat everything that has been said in the literature review, and they don't try to mix up their findings with what the literature has said. Very often, they comply to everything that has been said in the literature already. They suggest that their findings support everything that the literature has said already. And in this way, I wonder what's the purpose of conducting this study. If you don't find anything new, if there is nothing exciting, or at least you don't challenge some previous assumptions that we've may had because of reading that literature, then what's the purpose of this research? So make sure you adopt a critical stance when it comes to the literature review, but especially the discussion chapter, because this will allow you to claim some contribution. Don't be overly descriptive. Don't simply share the account of literatures that has been published on the topic. Attack some of those scholars. It should be a constructive criticism, of course. If you have findings that are conflicting with what has already been found, try to explain why this variance in the findings. The next thing to consider, of course, is the conclusion chapter, where most people fail to introduce contributions to theory and contributions to practice. Remember, for being recognized for your efforts and getting a very high recognition on your research project, you have to have both theoretical and practical implications. Your research needs to propose such implications. You need to contribute both to theory and practice. And also, of course, you have to outline areas for future research. Many people completely ignore this. They forget about this. They're happy to be almost done, and then they just leave this away. And this is wrong, and you should consider these at least. So what do I actually do when looking at the reference section? Or do people actually look at the reference section of any research? As a matter of fact, yes, we do. We have a quick look at it, and we pay attention to some very important points. The first thing is the year of publication. If you have used very old research, very old literature, we can flag this up. I always say people, okay, this is good, but couldn't you find more contemporary literature? It should be a nice mix of old literature because it helps you to present the foundation of the field, but also recent contemporary literature. That's the first thing I'm looking at. The second thing I'm looking at is the sort of sources that were referenced. Me and my colleagues, we pay much more attention to references that mention journals. So journals, these are typically peer-reviewed journals, and therefore this is something that signals higher quality. of the publication. If you are instead referencing, let's say, conferences or even books, then I'll definitely point this out. I'll definitely say you need more references to credible journals. And of course, there is different interpretations to what a credible journal actually is, but in each field there is a consensus. So if you're in a given field, you would more or less know what the top journals are. You can look at some of the rankings for journal publications, particularly, let's say, in the domain of business. There is the Financial Times journal ranking. There is also in the UK the Research Excellence Framework, and they have a journal ranking. So if you're unsure about whether the journal you're using is credible, you can quickly check that. But I would say that's not something that I pay too much attention. I don't try to convince people to look at the rankings of the journals, as long as they have a good mix of different types of sources, journal sources. You can have some books, definitely no Wikipedia for sure. I do look at the appendix section as well. I want to make sure that students have one, because this is a very clear sign of the quality of research. Because very often, the appendix section does not count towards the word count. So most people don't bother to write anything or put anything in there, which is a clear sign of, let's say, the ethics of the student towards the research, towards the work. If they put some effort in writing a clear appendix section, then this certainly counts for extra credit, and I certainly look that favorably. So make sure you don't skip this step. It's quite important. Okay, this is pretty much all the feedback that people will come up with when looking at a dissertation or a research project. So these are some of the very common things that stick out. Hopefully, knowing what these are, you will now consider how you can improve your work. So this is everything for today. I'm gonna catch you in the next video, and peace out.